this course is aimed at both absolute beginners, but folks who've also had some programming experience who are coming to JavaScript from other languages. The thing about JavaScript is that it's actually a very simple, small language. The core of it's pretty small, but it behaves differently than most of the languages you're used to. So programmers who are coming to it from somewhere else can get tripped up pretty easily, and we'll make sure that by the end of the day, you won't be. Whoops. Hang on just a second. Let me just turn that phone off. Okay. And if you've had no programming experience at all, JavaScript is designed actually to be a very straightforward, pretty simple language to work in. It's pretty forgiving when you're doing the basic stuff. So we'll try to cover all the bases. I've talked with everybody here. I know more or less what your backgrounds are. So I'll try to adapt examples to what you're doing. But of course, at any time, feel free to ask questions. If we are recording this class, so if there's some reason you want to ask a question about your work or something that you just don't want caught on the video, catch me at a break, catch me at lunch. We'll talk about it separately. And there are a lot of people that say there's no such thing as a dumb question. And honestly, trial and error, asking questions is the only way you're going to learn. What I say to you is that if you ask a question, I promise to actually listen to it respectfully and to really pay attention, and then do what we can to find a solution together. So please don't be afraid to ask. And like I said, if you want it off camera, we can ask at a break, we can ask at lunch. The materials for this class are entirely online. The presentation's actually all done in HTML. And tinyurl.com/levelupjs will take you over to GitHub, where you can download the presentation. You can actually download the source files I used to create it. There are sample code to go along with this. You can type things in, reading them off the screen. You can cut and paste if you have the HTML file. Or if you download the repository from GitHub, you can actually use the individual files. Most of them are actually there in the thing, except for tiny code snippets. Uh-oh. There we go. So who am I? My name is Richard Clark. I'm the head of global training for a company called Kaazing. Now, some of you have been working in the web field for a while, might have heard of something called WebSockets. It's a high-speed, two-directional communications channel across the web. Our two founders at Kaazing invented it. So my job is to go around to customers, to prospects, to people who are interested in HTML5, and teach them enough web development. We can then turn around and teach them how to use WebSocket and do this high-speed communication. So this is basically my job as I go around and teach. I teach a lot of intermediate, a lot of advanced. So it's actually a real pleasure to be able to come down here and teach an introductory level class to get things started. Because really, to me, this is the rewarding part. This is helping people get started is wonderful. So my background is I was the lead instructor at Apple for about 5.5 years way back in the PowerPC era. Worked for General Magic, who you may or may not have heard of, but they basically built the first personal digital assistants, the first pocket devices. Unfortunately, Palm came out with a smaller device and basically ate their lunch. But I was there for a while. I was at Hewlett-Packard and Verifone, and kind of made the tour around the valley. So I've been around a while. And I'd ask you for a little bit about yourself, but we've actually gone and done that separately, a little bit off camera. We've talked. If you've come in later, we'll catch up at the break and just find out a bit about your experience. So let's get started. Now, I'm hoping that you've actually brought, and I hope you can read this. In the requirements for this class, what I suggested is you have a machine with just a text editor and a browser. And the browser I recommended was Chrome, Safari, or a modern copy of Firefox. You notice that IE isn't on that list. The catch with Internet Explorer is, unless you're running the absolute latest, they've lagged behind in the standards. Now, they've caught up very rapidly, but they've lagged a bit still in their JavaScript implementation. So what I'm teaching today is the current working version of JavaScript. It's called ES5. And if you're on any version of IE 9 or earlier, you're still getting ES3, which is the version of JavaScript that was current 12 years ago. So that's why I recommend something like Safari, Chrome, or Firefox. So we'll start with a little HTML5. And if you have a laptop with you, I actually encourage you to try things out in the browser. And I'll be doing that. I'll be showing you, these little snippets of things. But work along with this. And we'll have a bunch of little practices, a bunch of little mini labs for you to try things out and learn. We used to joke in mountaineering school that you learned everything twice. The first time in the classroom, and then the second time when your fingers were freezing off. Because you think you've got it in the classroom, but until you actually go in and try to do the stuff, that's when the real learning happens. So we'll start with a tiny bit of HTML5 just as a framework. And you'll notice it's a very small page. By the way, if you've been writing HTML for a while, this page may look very strange. Actually, let me just copy that into something and make it bigger. Because the poor people who are watching the recording would have had a hard time seeing it. So we'll start out with the HTML5 document type, doc type HTML. You don't need anything longer than that. So if you're one of the people that's used to seeing like the long DTD 4.0 transitional, that's all history. Basically, any browser that can render standard CSS, standard HTML and CSS, that doc type is enough to kick it into standards mode and have it render things in the standard way. It also turns on some special parsing rules for HTML5 that let you use a bunch of shorthands like, oh, nuts. I just found a typo in my materials. I'll have to fix that later. Or if you want to fork the repository on GitHub and fix it and check it back in, you certainly can do that too. So set the character set to UTF-8. This just avoids a raft of issues with not only other languages, but there's some security issues in certain browsers that shall not be named, but whose initials start with I. Put a title on it, just an H1 and a script area. You do not, by the way, in HTML5, you don't need to specify HTML header body. The way the spec is written, the browser knows that character set and title belong in the head. The rest of this belongs in the body. The browser actually automatically injects those tags when it parses the page. So in fact, if I open this up, let me just go save this to the disk. Make sure Hazel's turned off. OK, did you save to the desktop? I think you did. There you are. OK, so there's my practice page. Let me come down here and make this larger. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Let me do it in Chrome, it's easier. There, that's what I wanted to be able to do, is to blow that up so you could see it. See? When the browser parsed it, it actually inserted the other tags around. But because screen real estate on a slide is really precious, you leave those out. Also, because if you're writing for mobile devices, you want to try to minimize the number of bytes on the wire, so you use that shorter version of the markup. So, I know it's not an HTML5 class, but useful background there. OK, so anyway, a little bit of HTML5. And there's a script area down here at the bottom. Again, I'm assuming that some folks are novices. So we're going to create a script tag. Now we're going to write our first JavaScript. And of course, the first program that every developer writes is hello world. So if I take here, and again, you are welcome to follow along on your own machine. So if I say alert hello world right there, and I run the page, it pops up and says, hello world. That's kind of the first program that everybody writes. So what just happened here? What did we just do? Up. This way. So the script tag, open script tag, the close script tag, those wrap around a chunk of JavaScript. You will also see, especially on older browsers, so in pre-HTML5 browsers, you'll see script type equals text JavaScript. That MIME type on there of text JavaScript is completely optional in HTML5. The browser assumes that if you put it a script tag and you don't see otherwise, that it will be JavaScript. So those wrappers say this is JavaScript. The command, the word alert in this case, is an instruction to the browser that says pop up a message. And then we say, OK, so what message should I put up? 2 parentheses here. So a word plus parenthesis open and close indicates an instruction to the browser, what's called a function or a method. And then this in the middle here is called a string. It's a series of characters. You can use double quotes on either end. You can also alternately use single quotes on either end. JavaScript doesn't care. If you need to say something like, if you need a single quote, say a single quoted string, if you single quoted a string and you need to stuff a single quote in there, put a backslash in front of it. Backslash is called an escape character. It has a handful of special uses. But this is a very common, very common setup. So for practice, what I'd like you to do is to set up this example on your own machine. And then do 2 things. First thing is just try changing the message to something else. And then try changing alert to confirm and see what happens. So this will just take a minute. Go ahead and run that. And don't worry, it's not going to be this basic all the way through. But we have to start at the ground floor and just make sure that we've touched on all those bases. By the end of the day, though, you'll be doing more advanced things in JavaScript and also doing more advanced manipulations in the page, actually doing some HTML DOM programming.
Can you make that a bit bigger?
I can't make the text on the slide any larger, unfortunately. It's the way the code's written. But I can make this bigger. OK. Yeah, it depends what browser you're going to run. Do you want to leave the tags, do you leave the tags out or not?
What about for other things that would go in the head, all various meta tags,
Yeah.
title tags?
Because the other meta tags, title tags, and all that are defined by the spec as they live in the head of the page, the browser will know that those go in the head section.
Anything up there, multiple calls to CSS style sheets or Google Fonts or anything like that, like rel links or whatever.
So the style sheet question's a little trickier because style sheet calls can go in the head or the body. Basically, I would have to look and see what the explicit rule is, and the full HTML spec is over 1,000 pages. I believe the rule, though, is the first time it hits an element that's rendered as part of the body, that's when it inserts the implicit body tag.
So is there any software that can take a page written in this nice new HTML5 method and kind of add all the junk that you need to make it work on the older browsers?
So, question is there any software that will take that shorthand markup and turn it long form? I don't know if anyone's done it. If you look at the site called validator.nu, there's an HTML5 validator, and the engine that he uses for that is open source, and it's written in Java. So you can actually use it to parse a page, even using the shorthand markup, and it will emit on the other side parsing events as if it was parsing a complete, fully filled out page. So you could then take and reassemble a page from those events. It would be a fairly straightforward piece of software to write. Okay, so folks got through this. You changed the message. You changed alert to confirm. You saw what happened. Again, if you've been programming for a while, you could probably do this one before your first cup of coffee, no problem. But we've got to span the range of people we've got here. So like I said, we'll start with some fairly basic stuff. So some terminology. Alert here is called a function. You will also hear it called a method sometimes when it's used inside of an object, but technically speaking, it is a function. So the parentheses wrap around what's called the argument list, sometimes called the parameter list. And then there is one string passed in as an argument. And again, like I said, we're being basic here. We'll get out of basic in a minute. Another way to do this without popping it up on the screen is console.log. So if you notice on my browser, let me bring up Chrome here. I'm going to open up the console. And if I ran a script, actually, let me do this. So I changed the script to say console.log, hello world, and now the message shows up in the console. So this is very commonly used for leaving notes to yourself as the programmer. You might be running along in your program and wonder, well, what's the value here at this point? What's happening here? So you'll leave yourself little breadcrumbs, little debugging messages. One caution about console.log. All the modern browsers have it. But if you go back even to Firefox 3.5, console was not built into Firefox 3.5. So if you had a console.log statement in your script, it would actually crash the script. The script would break. Unless somebody had Firebug installed, which created all kinds of entertainment because developers mostly had Firebug installed, and they'd use console log statements, and they'd ship it, and their customers wouldn't have Firebug installed, and suddenly the scripts would be dying all over the place. So be aware that console.log is not universally available. It is in the modern browsers, though. There is a really nice script you can get a hold of written by Ben Allman called BA debug that is a console.log alternative that works on older browsers, and it actually has a little bookmarklet, a thing you can drag to the bookmarks bar and click on that will show you all of the logged messages even if there's no console log available in that older browser. So explaining yourself, and again, I hope you can see this. If not, the slideshow software is being a little tricky today, so we'll just do this. So these are what are called comments. Slash star, you have to have a matching star slash at the end of that line or somewhere later. That's just a note to yourself as a developer. In JavaScript, you can also do slash slash, and that comment continues to the end of the line. Yes, here we go. All right, variables and expressions. Again, we'll keep this pretty straightforward and short. So if you remember algebra, saying things like y equals x plus 5, same thing in JavaScript. So except what you do is you declare what's called a var, a variable. So you might say var x equals 3. What this does is this allocates a little bit of space in the memory of the computer, puts the number 3 inside of that space, and gives it the name x. And so now, in the future, if you use the word x, you'll either get the value back that you stored in there, which is the 3, or you could say something like x equals 4 and replace the value in that storage. Or var y equals x plus 5. Again, all the people who've been programming already are saying, okay, we get this bit. But this is something important to know, if you're a new developer. Now, one side effect of this, let me do it now. So JavaScript does this interesting thing that if you forget the word var, but you use the name of a variable, by default, it will actually create a new variable with that name. And it will create it in what's called the global namespace. It creates it as a global, which was intended to be very convenient for programmers because you didn't have to do quite so much bookkeeping. In practice, it turns out to be a bit of a disaster. Because if you mistype the name of something, suddenly you've got this new variable, the data goes off into there, and now you don't know where your information is. The way to avoid that problem where JavaScript automatically makes a var out of everything it doesn't recognize is to actually write a string at the top of your file or at the top of your function when we get there, says use strict, and put a semicolon at the end of the line. This enables something called strict mode. It basically tightens up the rules in JavaScript as to what it will permit. And so it's considered a best practice to just go ahead and do a use strict at the top of your file to prevent this automatic variable definition and a couple of the other uglier corners of JavaScript. So then JavaScript does math. If I wanted to find the area of something, I could say, take the formula pi r squared, and I could say, okay, well, if the radius is 3, then area is math.pi. Math is a collection of useful math utilities and constants. Now, we don't have the x for multiplication or that dot for multiplication that you might see in more advanced textbooks. We use the star symbol, an asterisk. So this says math.pi multiplied by, and to get r squared, this is just the easiest way to do it, multiply r times r. That's as fancy as the math is going to get in this session, by the way. So you have common operators, plus, minus, star for multiplication, division. The ones I didn't mention. Go ahead.
On the line where you had var argument equals a string, you didn't have a semicolon at the end of the line.
Good question. So you caught that when I said var argument equals some string, and I forgot the semicolon on the end of the line. So semicolon in JavaScript is what's called the statement separator. It's like the period at the end of a sentence. It says, okay, I've asked you to do thing A. Now I'm going to ask you to do thing B. In most languages, they strictly require that semicolon on the end of the line. In JavaScript's a little more forgiving. If you forget the semicolon, JavaScript will automatically insert one at that spot. If it expects to see a semicolon and it doesn't, it'll put one there automatically, which is most of the time good every once in a while will bite you. It'll get you with a bug that you don't expect. And there are some people that actually advocate a style of writing JavaScript that uses no semicolons at all, that lets that error correction mechanism insert them. Mostly people who are coming from the Ruby language and some of the Python folks who don't usually use statement separators that way. But in this case, it was a typo, but it was also a chance to mention that. JavaScript is pretty forgiving. So let's now make up an actual function, something to calculate the area of a circle. So I use the word function. Actually, again, let me copy that for the folks in the back of the room to something larger. I decided I wanted to try something other than using PowerPoint this time around. So I'm using a very common way of creating a slide, something called Markdown, and then a slide generator in HTML. And it turns out it has very funny ideas about how you should size things. So anyway, I'm going to declare a function for calculating the area of a circle, give it the radius. So that r in parentheses is a placeholder. It's a parameter to the function. I'm going to supply a number there later. So create a variable to hold the result. Result equals, again, math.py times r squared, and then return the result. So return means take this value and give it back to whoever ran this function. Running the function is called calling the function. So I'm going to return a value back to the caller. So if I said alert, actually I'll console log it. And I'll use plus to combine the string with something else. And I'll say area of 3. So when I say area parenthesis 3, I'm saying run the area command, run the area function, take the number 3 and pass it in as an argument. That number 3 gets connected to the value r there, so now r is equal to 3. I do the math, and it takes that result and gives it back to me. Returning the result says give it back to the function out of the function here, and then that number is put back here and combined with the string. So let me run that. And it says the area of 3 is 28.274 and runs on like that. So the word return does two things. It takes the value and hands it back out of the function. It also terminates the function. It stops the function. So sometimes you'll see people do things like, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but let's say I don't want to try to take the area of a circle of negative size. I could say, well, if r was less than 0, return some value like -1. And so that would take a shortcut out of the function. It would test something. If that test was true, it would run out of the function immediately. Otherwise, it would continue on the line beneath it. I can also shorten this up. I really don't need an intermediate variable here. I could actually just do that. But I didn't want to be quite that terse. 2 semicolons, it actually doesn't matter. Actually, last statement of here, it doesn't need a semicolon at all, but it doesn't hurt you to leave it on. So this is a pretty big jump. If you're already a programmer, it's no big deal. But if you're not a programmer, this may be a little bit alien. Is there any uncertainty or questions about what's happening at this point? Okay, and again, feel free to ask me separately if that's what you would prefer. So we've already seen using the function. Functions can have multiple arguments to them. So if we do something like this, I can have a function add. Now it takes 2 arguments. In this case, it uses plus between them and hands back the result. So I could say add 2, comma 2. What would the result be of that function? 4. What would the result of add hello and world be?
Hello world.
Hello world, right? Because the other use of plus is to plug strings together. And again, especially if you're new, I do suggest trying these things out in the browser. So in fact, here's a bit of practice. So write a function that will take 3 numbers in and find the average of them. So, a plus b plus c and divide it by 3. You'll need to put parentheses around the addition just like you do in high school algebra. Because otherwise, division has higher precedence. So what would happen is if you said a plus b plus c divide by 3, divide is considered higher precedent, more important than the addition, so it would actually divide the last number by 3 and then add the first 2, not what you expected. But yeah, go ahead and write this function, try it out. We'll come back in a few minutes and I'll demonstrate how to do it. So the task is here. Right, yeah. Write a function to average 3 numbers. So I could say add 2, comma 2. What would the result be of that function? 4. What would the result of add hello and world be? Hello world, right? Because the other use of plus is to plug strings together. And again, especially if you're new, I do suggest trying these things out in the browser. So in fact, here's a bit of practice. So write a function that will take 3 numbers in and find the average of them. So, a plus b plus c and divide it by 3. You'll need to put parentheses around the addition just like you do in high school algebra. Because otherwise, division has higher precedence. So what would happen is if you said a plus b plus c divide by 3, divide is considered higher precedent, more important than the addition, so it would actually divide the last number by 3 and then add the first 2, not what you expect. Let's say that somehow I split those across the line. What's going to happen is that JavaScript is going to do this and say, oh, okay, I assume there's a semicolon there. And so now it has what it thinks is a variable called alert, and now it has a standalone number 3. One of the ways you can run this particular line is one of the rules that people write semicolon is JavaScript is they always they make sure that the line is always in like this. There's some other rules about it. I think it gets things you just have to do when you start writing these.
I have in the class that got canceled.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
One of the instructors couldn't make it in,
Oh no.
so they're moving us around.
What was the class?
HTML5 game development.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope you'll find some useful things in here. It's going to be a little basic. It's a little bit basic at the
I
moment.
know, that's good.
And then we're going into some DOM manipulation stuff, and there'll be a little bit of data graphics and some other fun things.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to walk around in a second and see how people are
I
doing.
brought my book.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so I looked around the room. I think everybody got this, just to be sure. Let me just go ahead and write the function here. So we'll say function average, a, b, and c. And I return a plus b plus c and I divide it by 3. And then I can say something like console.log I could do that. Let me run the file. Let me run it, and it comes up with the average. Now, a couple of interesting things here. First off, I did put parentheses around a plus b plus c because I mentioned something called precedence. If you were doing regular algebra and you wrote the expression 1 plus 2 plus 3 divided by 3, the rules of algebra say that that division has to be the first thing that you do. It's higher precedence. It comes before plus and minus. The same is true in JavaScript math. Multiply and divide will happen before plus and minus, so you have to put parentheses around it. But here's a funny one. Let's say I wanted to write something to average any number of inputs. There's something very interesting in JavaScript called arguments. And again, we're going to get slightly ahead of ourselves, but it's kind of a fun thing here. For the developers in the room, you can have fun with this one. So I could say something like, and if this is really unclear to you right now, don't worry, we will get you here. I need some value here, and I have to start it at 0. You could actually do this, which is start with the number 0. We'll talk about for loops in a minute. Basically, that thing that says for, that expression says arguments is a list of numbers. This says look at every number in that list, add them all to the sum, and then return the sum divided by the number of arguments. Okay, if I call this a no arguments, I'm going to get a bad result. But this is kind of a clever hack. It's one of the things in JavaScript that every function has an arguments object that lists all the arguments passed in, whether or not the function declares a name for them. So, okay, actually did a bit of writing break. We'll take a stretch break in a little bit. So let's talk about control structures, just the last kind of basic thing. So control structures, how do you make decisions in a language? What do you do, for example? Let me show it to you here. So let's say I need to decide if number is positive or negative. So I create a function called positive or negative, and I say if n is greater than 0, then return one value. Actually, in this case, console.log n is positive. Otherwise, console.log n is negative. Now notice those funny curly brackets around the outside. This is called a code block. Every function has a set of brackets around the outside, so it has a code block on the outside. But what I'm saying here is if n is larger than 0, and I set up another code block that says just do the things in this block, because there might be more than one statement. I might want to do more than one thing inside that. And in this case, I say else, do the other thing. There's actually a shortcut for if. Again, if you're programming in other languages, this will be familiar. If it's a single line expression, you don't actually need the brackets around it. It's only if you need multiple lines. But putting the brackets in makes things clearer, makes things more obvious. Is anybody unclear about this bit right here? This is another kind of big jump conceptually. Okay. You can simplify this down, actually. Let me show you the simplified version. And again, I will copy it to the back of the room display. So I can create a function called isPositive. You give it a number, and it tells you if that's positive. And this just says return n is greater than 0. Huh? What's that doing? So there are two special values in JavaScript. One's called true and one's called false. If true, always happens. If false, never does. So in this case, I said compare n to 0. That result will either be true or false, and so I'm returning that to the function. And now I'm using it down here. If it is positive n, this returns true. Do this console log. Else, meaning otherwise, do that console log. And again, I left out the braces on these, the code blocks, because for an if statement where you have a single line, you don't actually need to put the brackets around it. But you've actually, go ahead. I'm sorry? That is a greater than 0. We'll talk about that. Yes, we'll talk about that. So there's an even shorter version of this, which is a little bit of a brain bender, where you can say, let's say if I want to know if something is positive, I can actually say something like, and then I write this funny looking expression, n is greater than 0, question mark, in this case I'll say positive, colon, negative, and that's a regular colon, not a semicolon. And what this does, oh, I'm missing a close parent. What this does is this runs the test, and if it's true, gets and returns the first value, and if it's false, it gets it basically, if it's true, it does what's here, and if it's false, it does what's there after the colon. It's called a ternary operator. It's a shorthand. If you're writing a bunch of JavaScript, or looking at people's libraries, get used to it. It's fairly popular, but it's very terse, and so folks, some people don't like it because it is so terse. Now you could do other things like if you wanted to repeat an action multiple times, you can say something like here's a block of stuff, do what's inside this block while this test is true, while x is less than or equal to 10. So that block will run at least once, and then it'll check the test at the end and decide whether to keep going. So repeat this stuff over and over. Another way to repeat is in the other direction. I can actually move the while up here. While x is less than 10, repeat what's inside the block. The most common error that developers make in this stuff is they forget to actually update the variable at the end of the block, so it just goes on forever. It's the joke about the computer scientist. The computer scientist, they find his body in the shower. The bottle of shampoo said lather, rinse, repeat.
That's a good one.
And then the thing that I showed you, the thing that I was using earlier in calculating an average is what's called a for loop. And a for loop is actually, this is one of the mainstays of all programming. So a for loop has 3 parts to it. The word for, and then the first thing it has before the first semicolon is take whatever variables you have here and set them up to these values at the beginning. So in this case it says start by putting the number 1 into x. And then it says while x is less than or equal to 10, do what's in here. And after you've done what's in here, do this last statement, x equals x plus 1, so add 1 to x. So the net result is I start with a 1. As long as the value is less than or equal to 10, I call console.log with that value, and then I get the next number. So this will print the numbers 1 through 10. Again, if you've already learned it, it's pretty straightforward. If it's the first time you're seeing it, it can be a little bit of a head scratcher. But this is probably the most commonly used construct in all programming, other than maybe the variable statement. Because you have to do things repeatedly over a bunch of stuff. Now, if you are coming from a language, let's say you needed 2 different variables there. you can actually say in JavaScript for, like x equals 1, comma, y equals 2, and then the semicolon. You can actually use the comma operator, which is not really well known in JavaScript, to separate actions inside of a statement. So if you needed to initialize a bunch of variables, you could do it.
Are you going to give us an example of that?
Well, nothing formal in the slides. I can point you at a write-up on it. Hardly anybody uses the comma. Comma operator is kind of a weird corner case. Not many people use it. This is the most common usage when you need to set up a bunch of variables at the start of something. So slightly shorter version of this. Bunch of shorthands here, but again, if you're a programmer already, the shorthands come in useful. First off, I don't really need to declare the variables separately. I can say var right here at the start of the for loop, var x equals 1, x is less than or equal to 10, and then that last little thing at the end, x plus plus, again, C programmers are going to say, yeah, we know this one. Plus plus after a variable name says return the variable and then add 1 to it. In this case, developers just use this as a shorthand for add 1 to x. So you can say x minus minus, which is subtract 1. You can say plus plus x, which actually means the same thing, add 1 to x and then return it. So but you'll see that plus plus shorthand a lot. Okay, so practice this. Go set up a for loop, count from 1 to 10. Easiest way to do it, if you have something like Chrome running or Firefox with Firebug, is just do it in the console. You can type JavaScript statements directly into the console. So I can write something like var x equals 1. Now let's do like var equals 10. Do while. So. I could do something like that. So try it out. I'll leave the instructions on the screen. So do like count 1 to 10 in the console, do it backwards for fun, show whether each number is odd or even. And then we've been going for an hour and slogging through some tricky stuff. Take just a short stretch break after this, about 5 minutes or whatever. There's a truism in the classroom that says, you can only learn as much as your seat can take sitting. So, and I really don't want to spend I don't want to burn you out this morning when we've got lots of interesting things coming up in this session. Oh, you still need to call a function. So you need to see. Oh, do this after you define the function. Or